the IPCC assessment, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we have to cite the peer-reviewed literature, ideally within the last 5 years. And I've been asked to work on this in relation to Indigenous people, but most of the research is not from Indigenous people's perspective, if there is anything out there. And I say in the circles that I'm in, and it's never really well received, I find, is if people weren't asking the right questions decades ago, 4 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we don't have the existing body of knowledge. So when solutions are being proposed, when all these studies are taking place in terms of mitigation, adaptation, risk and vulnerability and resilience, we don't actually literally have the body of knowledge in the scientific realm. My view is that in the Indigenous lived experience and people's knowledge and their own legal traditions, they do know what this is, but it really hasn't made headway in terms of discussions around climate change. The other point that I'll mention before I turn it over to Teresa is when I'm in these spaces is I find that there's certain language that makes people very uncomfortable. And that language is usually, if I bring up, well, colonialism is an issue in terms of Indigenous peoples, the impact on Indigenous peoples, their vulnerability, and then their ability to be able to adapt and then govern whatever climate changes or whatever kind of climate kind of decisions that they want to make. And that goes over a lot of people's heads. They're like, I don't understand what that has to do with anything. And so that's another area that I find problematic. They also don't like it if I say climate justice, because justice implies injustice. People just like to stick to kind of the safe language of climate change. So I found in my own context of my work that Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of calling it a climate emergency long before the IPCC reports did. So they were ahead of the game in terms of what the impacts were and what needed to be done in order to address climate change. So I'll stop there because I can draw on and answer questions about some of these experiences, but it's really, what it's done is it's really laid for me the foundation of how I want to approach Indigenous climate futures and the voices that are missing and the kind of advocacy work that I want to do in the spaces that I'm in that hopefully will help change this imbalance that currently exists. So thank you for listening to these different spaces that I find myself in, and hopefully you'll learn from what else I can share and what I've learned from, particularly from First Nations and in the Indigenous context.
Thank you, Dr. McGregor. It is really an honor to be in this virtual space with you to have these discussions. I became familiar with your work through water security, environmental justice, and now I'm excited to hear about your current work on climate justice. I'd actually like to hear a bit more about how do you perceive the role of traditional knowledge entering into these climate justice conversations? And also, if you could speak more to this term climate justice, and when did that become a term that's being used in these international conversations?
To me, Indigenous knowledge at this point is getting the nod a bit with the Paris Accord, but not really in a meaningful way. And what I found in the work that I was doing, trying to support some of the IPCC assessments, and also I'm involved in the Canadian ones. Canada now is undergoing national assessments, is they, well, one, they lack the knowledge, and it requires a lot of advocacy to recognize that there are gaps. But my view is Indigenous peoples already know the changes that everyone else is trying to assess. Like they're trying to figure out what Indigenous peoples already kind of know in terms of Indigenous knowledge. So I found in a lot of these processes, there's interest in it, and there's acknowledgement that it's a thing, and we need to do something and acknowledge Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge. There's different terminology for this, but people actually don't know how to do it. That's what I find is a big issue in the Canadian context. There's development of an Indigenous knowledge, a national framework, but to try to provide guidance. But even after decades, like we've been having this conversation for 4 decades and a lot, and I mean you and I, but in the Canadian context, and I find myself answering the same questions as I did, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. So there's acknowledgement of traditional knowledge, but people don't know how to do it. And I think part of the problem is recognizing Indigenous peoples as peoples and societies, and treating Indigenous peoples that way. You're not going to protect Indigenous knowledge. You're not going to, have Indigenous people share this knowledge unless there's actually Indigenous people. So it involves protecting Indigenous peoples, their livelihoods, their lands, recognizing rights. And I find, a lot of proponents don't want to go there. They just want kind of the knowledge. So there's a very kind of extractive process. So there's acknowledgement, but how people do it is not quite there. Climate justice, I still think it's a bit of a struggle to still in some of the spaces that I'm in, because it implies inequity. You have to go outside of the realm of scientific assessments and look at what are the existing inequities in society and how does climate change exacerbate those. So for example, again, in the Canadian context, and I know this is the case also in the United States with tribes and Indigenous peoples there, is that there's health disparities. You're already starting off with health disparities. You're already starting off with income disparities. So you're already starting off from this context that often flowed, or more often than not, I can't even think of any other reason other than colonialism that this happened. So you're starting from this certain place. And how do you account for that? And I find there's difficulty in accounting for that. So I think folks kind of shy away from that, because how do you assess that? How do you understand that? And then what do you do about that? And what I found that means in again, some of the spaces that I'm in is that a lot of the solutions that are being proposed can actually cause inequity and injustice when you peel back the layers. And I find that makes, like, people are very, very invested, I found, especially economists and engineers, in certain kind of solutions and outcomes. And when you or anybody else brings up these other kind of issues, they're not trained in that. Like, it hasn't really been a very interdisciplinary kind of field. Like I'm reading this report recently where it spoke to most of the climate change research went to natural sciences and technical sciences, very little to the social sciences. So there's a real imbalance even within the scientific assessments, let alone acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge. So that's a long-winded sort of answer to your question. It's a good question.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, conversely, thinking about the limitations of how traditional knowledge is taken up, and then perhaps in the ways that traditional knowledge is extracted and then used towards certain ends and maybe not others, things that would disrupt existing structures of capitalism and settler colonialism. All of these critiques, which I think are, well known within our academic circles and activist circles. But I'm actually curious to know, how often do critiques of, say, settler colonialism or capitalism come up in these climate justice conversations? And to what extent can change be possible without acknowledging the root structures of these problems that we see as like being so obvious?
Yeah, challenging question to answer. So I think in the discussions you're starting to have them, and largely because of Indigenous advocacy. So that's really, in my view, where the change is actually happening because of Indigenous advocacy. I mean, it would be great if the research supported that. And, in some of the assessments that I was writing, and we're given very little space. You have like 400 words to explain the whole history of, and I had to do Canada, US, and water and vulnerability and risk and climate change and traditional knowledge, is trying to point to the literature, because you had to rely on the literature, which was annoying because you already know the reality of people. And then you're trying to prove the reality of the people through assessments. But fortunately, there's a growing body of work that points to that, thank goodness, because you're able to say, this is going to be a barrier to people's ability to be able to adapt and be able to be resilient in the face of climate change. So to me, the conversation is starting to happen, but I find, and not only Indigenous peoples, but allies and also BIPOC as well, like anybody who's experiencing inequities is saying, hey, like I'm not experiencing this in the same way. So the solutions need to account for these variations in people's experience, whether you're in the north or in the south or urban or non-urban. So those conversations are starting to happen, but in my view, and in my experience, where I've seen, because I've been in these workshops, prioritizing climate change workshops, and other ones on science and traditional knowledge, and then you're inputting and then you don't really see it in any of the resultant reports. But when there's advocacy, then I find that has a fairly huge influence. So being able to support people at the community level to continue their advocacy. And we know the upcoming IPCC meeting, COP meeting 26 in Scotland this year. So Indigenous peoples need to have a lot of support in order to be able to do the advocacy work. Even though I'm sure, well, I've talked to people who go and they feel frustrated a lot of times. I'm like, that's the voice that people need to hear. The science stuff is already conveyed to people in the big reports that come out, and those are important. I would never say they're not. But I find that they're the truth, but it's not the whole truth. There's a whole bunch of other truth that needs to come out, that needs to come to light in terms of exactly how are we assessing what the problem is, and then how are we going to, what's going to be, like how we're diagnosing it, and then what we think are going to be the solutions to the big challenge that basically all of humanity and the planet is facing.
For some of our viewers who maybe aren't as familiar with some of this terminology, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I'd like to hear a bit more about the Indigenous presence in these global venues, and perhaps why is it that Indigenous nations and communities are going to this global network as opposed to working more locally, regionally, or within respective governments, such as Canada or the United States. So yeah, I just wanted to hear more about this global venue and how successful you think it has been in providing this platform for Indigenous voices.
The actual platform, institutional platform that comes from the Paris Accord, I'm not sure how effective that's been. And when I say I'm not sure, that's kind of telling, because I don't basically think it has been. So I don't know how well Indigenous communities are in control of that, despite what you might see if you look for it, on a United Nations website. And I find one of the organizations that I've been working with recently is the Indigenous Climate Action. So I guess you could say Indigenous-led, ENGO-ish kind of, so it's not part of the political realm of Indigenous politics in Canada. They work outside of that. So they transcend all those spaces. So they're local, they're regional, they're national, they're international. So they don't ever go to the meetings without any kind of engagement with people on the ground. So they're able to, I believe, go with, confidence that what they're going to be advocating for makes a difference. So to me, it depends on who you're asking and probably how old you are. So, because when I think about the kind of conversations that people had even 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, Indigenous peoples have been saying the same thing, maybe not necessarily in climate change, but any kind of Indigenous International Environmental Declaration. I actually spend a great deal of time looking at those and see that people were calling this already. And they're able to mobilize that. And to the point where at one time, it was just completely ignored. And Indigenous peoples have to have their own separate meeting. Like there would be the main meeting going on and they would have their own separate one and they would have their own discussions and have their own declaration. Now you're part of those spaces and able to engage in that kind of advocacy. And pretty well what they're doing there is trying to convince nation states to accept the findings of these reports and make the transformative change that they're calling for in order to move the planet in a different direction than it's currently going in. So from my point of view, when I see that, it looks, when you're there and frustrated, it probably doesn't look like much is being achieved, but when you look at it over the longer term, you can see that it is. So for example, in the Canadian, so now I'm actually working on a separate report. Some other colleagues across the country, they're able to advocate for having a separate assessment specifically for Indigenous, as opposed to just being a box in somebody else's, because that's kind of what it is. You're a box, an example, cautionary tale of something, as opposed to having your own voice in your own assessment. So that's starting to happen. And starting to see recognition. So one of the reasons why there was so much interest in recent years is because IPCC, and Teresa kindly explained what that is, were criticized for not including Indigenous voice and traditional knowledge. So the main authors were given a charge to do that. They said, okay, you have to start including traditional. They weren't very good at it, but at least they kind of know they need to. And hopefully it improves over time. But again, that was because of critiques that were coming. Because they didn't have the whole knowledge that they needed to do in order to be able to advance where we were going with climate change or climate justice. Or now, I think they kind of recognize there is a climate emergency because some changes are now irreversible in the 2021 report. So it's quite, yeah, it's disturbing on all kinds of levels, but yeah.
Well, kind of along the lines of state engagements, I have a question here that's related to engagements with political leaders and maybe the efficacy of having Indigenous leadership advocate on behalf of Indigenous concerns and voices. So, you know, Deborah Haaland's historic appointment as Secretary of Interior, I think is really important, especially in these discussions around the restoration of Bears Ears. And I know this is a little bit maybe out of your wheelhouse and coming from a Canadian settler context, but I'm wondering if there's any examples that you can draw upon with First Nations in Canada of any leadership that are advocating on behalf of climate justice issues, and if that's a meaningful path or intervention in your perspective.
Well, I'm probably going to be hugely biased because I am part of the Assembly of First Nations Environment and Climate Change Committee, Advisory Committee. And Assembly of First Nations is a national organization for First Nations in Canada. And we advise on that. So there is that political advocacy. And often they can, because you need to be kind of accredited to go to IPCC, to be inside where you can influence decision making, as opposed to outside where, you know, the activism and a lot of the advocacy happens. And I haven't been myself. It's just never kind of worked out with teaching and everything else. But in my conversations with folks, it seems highly stressful and frustrating a lot of the times. But to me, there has to be a number of things happening at the same time. It just can't be a single approach and think that's going to work. So you need to have the political advocacy at the national level. You need to have Indigenous climate action who is more grassroots in their approach. You need to have elders there who can speak to the changes that they've seen over the decades of their lifetime. You need to have young people there talking about, you know, what future that they want. So I think there needs to be a number of things happening as opposed to a single thing. I don't think a single thing is going to yield the results, and having the message come from multiple places, probably in different ways. There's a difference between, you know, how a politician might speak to the nation states than compared to an elder telling their story, or a youth giving, you know, sharing impassioned words about what they see in terms of their future. So I think there needs to be multiple things happening. And my view is that there always needs to be support for the grassroots and people at the community level, because they're the ones who actually hold the knowledge that everyone else is then advocating for. They're the ones who live on the land. They're the ones who have the knowledge. They're the ones who are experiencing what's happening every day and over their lifetime. And they need to always be supported throughout this kind of process. They don't necessarily always want to go to these kind of meetings, probably especially now, considering the state of the planet and COVID and everything else, but they always need to be supported. You don't want to become too theoretical, conceptual, and abstract, and then lose touch with the community perspective. and experience.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point about community interventions. So speaking from a Dene perspective or context, you know, we think about the effects of human-driven climate change. Water security is a main concern, primarily drought. I mean, this image projected behind me of home, Dene the Navajo Nation. You can see the red desert. You know, I'm currently in Chicago, it's raining, but back home, I'm imagining the desert landscapes and the fact that we've been in this cyclical drought for years. And then also, you know, depletion of our aquifers. So, you know, our relationship to the effects of climate change is really centered around, you know, water scarcity, water security. So I'd like to hear more from your perspective, your homelands, about like on the ground, when you talk about communities, you know, how are they centering these discussions of climate change? What are the things that they see in their day-to-day lives as, okay, this is something that is evidence of climate change? Because you know, we all know that this is different when you think really locally about how this happens and how we see these changes occurring.
Well, this was an unprecedented year on Turtle Island in terms of fires and drought in different parts and a lot of rain in others. You have where you really need it, it's not there. Where maybe you want it in a bit more moderate way, there's a lot. So to me, I think where people really felt it was with the heat wave and the fires and just the existing vulnerabilities in different Indigenous people's communities. And so basically in Canada, a whole town burnt down, and there was a First Nation right beside it, but it was kind of weird because the front page news is all about how Lytton, the town, burnt down, and really not a lot on the First Nation. But you know, it was one of those kind of communities where they're kind of intertwined, like the band office was actually in the community and it was totally burnt down. But Indigenous peoples, again, are impacted differently. So there was also massive out of control fires and also Northwestern Ontario. So not far, well, geographically speaking, in terms of Turtle Island, not too far from where I was in the Great Lakes. And the way that Indigenous peoples experience evacuation, so when people have to evacuate, is in those flying communities, you're waiting to get on a plane to get out of there. It's not like, you know, piling up your truck, and that's not fun. I would absolutely not minimize the trauma that people went through to see a fire coming, put everything you can, grab the pet, you know, get out to relatives wherever, right? You can drive to. That's not the case for flying communities. So they have to take everything, but, well, they can't actually because you're getting on a plane and a lot of people are trying to get on the plane to be evacuated in the community. Then they're taken to southern communities where that may not be people's first language. Like so Northwestern Ontario flying community is taken to one of the furthermost southeastern communities to, you know, because the community is able to help folks or take them in as they try to weather this fire. And the interesting thing about it was the health effects of the smoke. And so periods of time I was up north, and then in Toronto, but you could smell the smoke in Toronto. Like it was like it was far-reaching in terms of the impact. So even so the heat and the kind of changes that people are seeing in terms of the wildlife, in terms of the plants, in terms of the insects. Like, so in my area, the gypsy moth, which was an introduced species, they're out of control. They totally eat all the leaves on the trees when the winter isn't cold enough. So there's been an increasing number of that. So that affects the wildlife because things don't grow as well. What are the bears going to eat? It's drier where the wetlands used to be. So there's the ecological impacts. People are concerned about fish because the inland lakes are warming, and the Great Lakes are also warming. So people are noticing in their lived experience, I'm not able to find basically food or the wildlife that they would normally rely on, different medicines that people would rely on. So they don't, so those are like, you have the big kind of emergency type of things, which are going to increase and people have experienced before. And you also have the everyday things that people have noticed over life. I can't find as many moose anymore. I can't find this medicine anymore. I can't find over time. So those are the kind of changes that they're starting to notice. or have noticed actually for quite some time. It's not just starting, it's just now you can call it something. And I think one of the important ways to understand Indigenous people's experience with this and the role of colonialism in this is that another thing that I find very frustrating when I call the circles that I'm in, probably more like squares, usually we're around tables actually, not even like circles, and is that a lot of this is environmental change that Indigenous peoples have experienced since colonization, for a very long time. So people either being relocated, moved, fly in communities, which is fine, but people also connected to each other all the time in a lot of these places and moved around in particular ways. So they were already experiencing environmental change. The very same root of the causes of those changes is the same as climate change, resource development, mining, flooding, forestry, all of that, deforestation. And it's kind of interesting when people go in and do their research, because a lot of community people who are hunters and trappers and on the land and collecting medicines, they're not part of the climate change circles I'm part of. They don't necessarily know the latest terminology. Even I'm constantly trying to catch up to figure out what's happening out there, right? So they'll talk about environmental change, which is and climate change is a continuation of that change. And I'm in spaces with scientists who say, no, that's environmental change, and they don't know what they're talking about because that's an environmental change, not a climate change. I'm like, but that's not how people experience it. Like they've been experiencing this for decades before climate change was even like a thing, right? In the scientific world or whatever else, right? Like people weren't publishing and writing a lot on this like they are now. There weren't journals on climate change at the time. So then a lot of what they say then gets dismissed because it's not couched in the kind of way that people can understand. So I've seen that where people have been environmental change that they've experienced and talk about gets dismissed. That's environmental change. That's not like climate change. And I'm like, seriously? Like, I think they kind of know their own experience better than you do, right? So it's so they they've got challenges, but they have noticed a lot. And I think it is important to know, like, Indigenous peoples are impacted differently than others. And again, I'm not going to say that other people's experience isn't devastating, because it is. It's just there's other considerations that need to be taken into account in an Indigenous context because of the way that people live and where they live and the connection that they have to the land and the reliance on that.
Yeah, what you're saying basically about these arbitrary terminologies, things that are thrown around to delegitimize basically Indigenous knowledge of lived experience on the land. I'm also wondering if perhaps if you could speak to this greater Great Lakes region, right? So, I mean, if we think about an entire ecology and landscape and relationship of Anishinaabe people in the entire region, but then you have this arbitrary geopolitical boundary between Canada and the United States. Is there any sort of conversations that are happening regionally in a way that push back on these nation state ideas of addressing climate change or environmental stewardship? And maybe that's perhaps a unique way to build greater solidarities. So maybe if you could speak to that. I don't know if you have a pointed answer to that, but I'm just really curious.
I mean, partly because of the sharing of knowledge. So I'm part of, part of it is academic, where people are sharing and like this context, but also in others, tribal meetings. I was just in the Rising Voices one last week or the week before. So this exchange of knowledge is occurring. And what I really like about them is that community people are there, talking about and presenting on what they're doing in their particular communities. So I think it's happening. So it does happen in those kind of formal ways. It's starting to happen with different research studies, but the problem with a lot of research studies is you kind of do the research and then people sort of then mobilize the findings, and that can take a while. Meanwhile, the conversations need to happen sooner than that. So one example that I can think of that again made me think about grassroots Indigenous people's understanding of climate change so differently. So this was a Potawatomi gathering. So they were holding it, I believe, for one of the first times in north of the border in Wasauksing. And because there's Potawatomi, part of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy. And it was really interesting. And people were meeting, and the discussion was around climate change and also plants. And this particular focus was on plants. This was a few years ago. And how do people then share knowledge around plants? Like, how is it different? Can people, like, there's some plants that are very plentiful in the Canadian context, like milkweed, and not so much somewhere in another place. And the people, in the South were saying, we can't find milkweed, but you've got a lot. Like, we make soup out of it, which I never heard of before. I went, hey, that's pretty cool. And so people, and we were told when the elders got together and knowledge holders got together, they said that's what they used to do. They used to assess what was maybe in the north. People visited, they went across the border, for lack of a better word, to share knowledge about what was needed in a community. So maybe in a northern Canadian context, you can't get certain medicines, you can't get certain plants. So they would visit each other and they would trade. But as a healer in a community, you're assessing what's sort of needed in the community. And one fellow was sharing a story about, I'd kind of like dropped my, grandfather off somewhere. He'd kind of disappear for a month because he's off visiting, collecting medicines and trading, right? And then he would come back. And people don't necessarily want this to be managed or governed by the state. Because and when I came out of that meeting and I was listening to all these stories about how people shared in that particular way, I came out of it and I thought, visiting is actually a climate change strategy. It's actually a way that people, again, it wasn't siloed. It was, we're assessing, we're looking at vulnerability of our communities, we're mitigating, we're also adapting, we're building resilience, and we're governing this among people who know medicines in different communities, and people in the South might have different medicines that people in the North can't access, and vice versa, or for whatever reason, they will be more plentiful in other areas. So they're constantly assessing all the time and diagnosing and figuring out strategies for how they're going to try to serve their communities. I remember noting that, probably wrote it down somewhere and haven't really talked about it till now, that actually visiting each other and sharing knowledge in that context is actually a climate change strategy. That's what we did for thousands of years. That's what we did. And that's bringing those kind of practices and that knowledge forward in order to be able to share. So this is kind of a gathering that you're not going to, there's probably not, maybe there'll be a little box somewhere in some climate change assessment. It says, oh, the Potawatomi get together and this is what they talk about. Oh, what a cute little climate change strategy. But actually it's huge territory when you think about it, huge. In terms of, some of the folks were from northern Quebec, and they're sharing with people, in the south of the border. So that, like, huge territory that people were doing this assessment and governing and coming together and discussing it. So that's an example that comes to mind, that it was so extraordinary. And I remember just sitting there going, kind of blown away by it, going, I don't think this is typically what people think about as being a strategy or potentially a solution to what we're going to be facing, and how can you try to keep communities healthy in light of what we're facing? Because people are assessing all the time. They're just not saying, I'm doing a climate assessment, but they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's just knowledge of of your environment and your land. Yeah, I mean, this listening to you speak right now, I feel like is actually it encompasses perfectly what the whole purpose of this symposium is. As Rose and Blair, the two other co-organizers at this conference, we really wanted to foreground Indigenous knowledge, but also, notions of relationality. And I think these concepts are present in our languages. For instance, in Dene Bazad, we talk about ke, which is kinship, but it's more than that. It's that's maybe a crude reduction to maybe anthropological terms, but it's about how you relate to everything around you, to human and non-human relatives, how you care for each other. So from your perspective and your experience, what sorts of frameworks are are being used maybe in these climate justice conversations, like specific Indigenous frameworks, as a way to actually say, you know, we have a word for this, we have a framework for this. This isn't just something that we are calling broadly, you know, traditional knowledge, but it's more specific. It's specific to a region and a place.
I'll answer that in a couple of ways because they're top of mind at the moment. One is our own stories, which will vary, but there's always going to be some similarities in them. So one of the areas that I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around right now is this whole big push for what's called nature-based solutions. And you would think that would be the kind of thing that, you know, Indigenous peoples would be all over, and a lot of people are, but fundamentally it comes from a different place, like you were talking about in the Navajo context, this idea of relational ontology of how kinship and how people, how entities, beings kind of relate to each other. And but when you're coming from a different place, it doesn't really quite make sense, because it still means that nature has to be in service of people, because people are, you know, not behaving in the way that they need to in relation to the natural world. So when I'm confronted with something like that, like it's not quite sitting right, and I'm trying to figure it out, like how do I wrap my head around this and then begin to talk about it in a different way? And then I go to stories, because the stories, and I didn't have a chance to talk about this story. It's my favorite story. I mean, it could, and the nature of stories, and Anishinaabe story is, it makes sense to you in a particular time and place and whatever kind of is on your mind and whatever the challenge is at the moment. So this is the Pipe and the Eagle story, but in this story, people aren't behaving properly, kind of like, you know, like it's happening, I suppose, around the world. And there's going to be a destruction. And it's the eagle who petitions on behalf of people and future generations in order to be able to save people. They're like, yeah, a lot of people are misbehaving, but what about future generations? We can still teach them to behave properly in relation to all of creation. So Eagle has to fly around and try to find people who are still, you know, following the instructions, behaving, for lack of a better word, properly in relation to all of creation, and they are able to. The eagle's able to find it. The eagle has 4 days to do it, and on the 4th day is able to find like a family where they're still engaging in ceremonies and still, you know, respecting the natural world. And what the story kind of tells me is it sort of parallels kind of what I kind of see as being what's happening in the climate justice world. But it's the other entities that bail us out in that instance, because people can be so brilliant yet destructive. Like we have the capacity to be destructive, but we also have the capacity to be so beautiful and innovative and find solutions and be creative. And whatever we choose to employ in particular situations is going to like produce particular kind of outcomes, right? So the eagle petitions on behalf of people because they still see a possibility. They still have hope that future generations are going to learn how to live better with the natural world. So the story tells me that humans aren't, they don't always have the answer. And it looks like that hasn't happened yet. Like I think about that last report, I'm like, I don't think it's happened yet. So maybe we need to turn to the stories and the natural world in order, sorry about that. No idea why that's doing that. But I'm in the middle of talking, or I can put it on mute, is to be able to go to the stories and see what they're telling us about our appropriate relations with the natural world. And what do we need to do in order to do that? So we've been there before. Like in Anishinaabe stories, there's usually we're facing a destruction. And usually when that happens, it's because we're not behaving properly in relation to each other and to the natural world. And often it's these non-human entities who bail us out. So they're still following their responsibilities. They're still doing what they're supposed to be doing. And are probably, this is like shocking when I'm in these other circles with scientists and engineers and economists, and I go, I think they're smarter than us because we don't have the answers. And that's like so horribly shocking to them. But in an Indigenous worldview and ontology, that's not unusual. It's like, yep, I guess that's what we need to do. So that story kind of reminds me of that. And that's how I think about nature-based solutions. I call it more nature derived. It comes from there, and we need to listen, and we need to engage with the creative, innovative, intuitive parts of ourselves in order to bring that forward in terms of how are we going to face the future, and where are we going to live hope, where are we going to have hope for future generations, because it looks pretty dismal to them, and who can blame them, right? And so that's how I think about that particular question. And I can't remember the second one because I got really excited about that story. But it's my favorite story. Like, I always have these favorite stories. When I work on water, it's like the Anishinaabe recreation story, and climate change, the pipe and the eagle is like my go-to story. And I go back to it every time. I'm like, and I learn something different from it every time when I'm confronted with these concepts that don't quite sit well with me and I don't know why. Then I go back to the knowledge. I go back to the stories and go, what are they telling us, and how can they inform, any kind of conversation that we could have around these broader concepts that are seen as being the solution.
Well, on the theme of traditional knowledge, I wanted to field a question from the audience, actually. This is about specifically around California Indian basket weavers who have been dealing with, climate change in the form of devastating fires, invasive species, drought. This audience member asks, what would you suggest that we do to call attention to these issues and get assistance to mitigate these devastating changes that impact our traditional practices?
That's an excellent question. And I think to some extent you hinted at this at the beginning, in terms of having people, Deb Howland, I believe at that kind of level, being able to try to influence the kind of impact that climate change is having on, especially in California, had a really rough time, I think, with fires and heat recently, similar to British Columbia. But I also think there needs to still be the grassroots work. And I don't know the context well enough to kind of know who some of the, and in this case, telling the story is the same as advocacy. People need to hear the story of how explicitly, people are being impacted and what they're noticing. Because that's actually basket weavers are noticing changes. They notice what plants and animals and even their own livelihood is being vulnerable. So again, they have that kind of holistic assessment that tends to be missing in what I will call, for lack of a better word, climate change stories. So they need to be able to tell their stories. And you probably notice better than I do. One of the ways to do it would be through multimedia, because you can get a story out there and you don't need anybody's permission you don't need to have a existing relationship with a particular organization in order to be able to kind of tell that story. So I think that needs to happen. And without knowing if there's any kind of organization per se where some of the advocacy can happen. I don't know that particular context that well, but I do think that those stories need to be told because they do approach it from a holistic point of view. And I'm hoping there could be ways that could be done through multimedia. So you don't have to go through particular organizations that may have their own kind of agendas. And it's one of the approaches and I'm not very good at it, I'll have to admit, in terms of multimedia. Through the work I do with environmental justice and now climate justice is trying to use multimedia, because not everyone wants to get the story. Not everyone wants the piece of paper and another report to read. That could be helpful if you have, some student researchers who want to work with you and they can advocate in those kind of spaces. But really, most people want to have something a bit more enlivened. They want to have that firsthand account of this is precisely what's happening, and this is when it happens. So sometimes I find those kind of mediums are better able to tell the stories. People are pretty good at social media and getting the word kind of out there. So I don't know how helpful that is, but I'm thinking some of these other means that don't require you to affiliate, you can, but you also need to be able to tell the story kind of on your own terms. And I don't find that happens enough with Indigenous people. I mean, I'm kind of guilty of that too as an academic. I try to mobilize it in very particular kind of ways, but I actually prefer that people just tell that story. from their own point of view and on their own terms.
Thank you. I'm now segueing to a question of sovereignty.
No.
So someone asked about, the limitations of Western sovereignty and its recognition of, you could say, an inherent Indigenous sovereignty. But to what extent do these concerns of sovereignty and political recognition contribute to a lack of recognition in terms of support for climate justice?
I see them as intimately related, actually, because there's this really kind of weird kind of tension, I guess is one way to describe it. So it's generally recognized that Indigenous peoples are more vulnerable, more at risk, and it's true. But and that's because of their relationship to the land, because that's what you'll see in the narrative. But at the same time, Indigenous peoples have all this knowledge to be able to share, to contribute to, addressing the challenges that we're facing because of their relationship to the land. And so there's this kind of really interesting, kind of crazy dynamic that kind of happens there. And I think at a Indigenous community level, it kind of makes perfect sense. But I think out there in the other policy kind of climate change world, they haven't quite wrapped their heads around that. But I think one of the main barriers to Indigenous peoples being able to govern and have autonomy over their own climate change future is because there's a lack of recognition of the rights and autonomy and sovereignty. The crown or the government still want to control that. And Indigenous people's role is to participate in it, to support their sovereignty, their climate change solutions, their climate change stuff. And that's what I've noticed. Like even for, the Paris Agreement and the clause, I can't remember which article it is, 35, I think, or 135. 35 is sticking in my head. That's meant to support like global climate change sovereignty or processes. That isn't intended to support Indigenous people's own sovereignty and their own processes. So most of these assessments, that's what they're supporting, not communities doing their own assessments and supporting their own governance and their own sovereignty. There's not a lot of support for that, even though that knowledge exists to be able to do it. So to me, I see that as one of the main hindrances, and there's very little research on that. Believe me, we spent a lot of time trying to find it this summer because we had one clause in there, self-determination, sovereignty, governance. Very hard to find anything on there because that's not what people are interested in funding, like funding agencies, right? So I don't know if that somehow answers the question, but no, I definitely see a link there. Indigenous peoples want to have control over that because other people's solutions aren't working all that well for us. They're not. These other solutions can actually be hugely problematic. So we need to have our own solutions and our own governance and our own way of approaching these huge threats, basically, to people's lives and livelihood, because it's a threat, like literally, to people's lives and livelihood. So no, I see that as an incredibly critical link, but not one that's like people like, yay, let's support Indigenous climate change sovereignty. I don't see a lot of that, except from Indigenous peoples who know that's a big problem in terms of seeing a future for yourself.
Well, I think this is an important note to end on, that, the interrelationality of these themes, that the support of Indigenous sovereignty is a question of climate justice, and is, that we are at that precipice right now. And Indigenous peoples and nations need to be, listened to and recognized in these capacities. So I just want to thank you, Dr. McGregor, for joining us for this wonderful conversation. And yeah, we'll look forward to continuing these dialogues tomorrow with the rest of Relational Futures. Thank
you, everyone, for listening, and hopefully that's a little bit of food for thought for other conversations that's going to happen. So thank you for having me and engaging with me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. McGregor, and Dr. Montoya as well. And again, we just want to give our special thanks to John W. and Jean M. Rowe for their support of the D'Arcy McNickle Distinguished Lecture, and to the Film Studies Center at the University of Chicago, the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at Northwestern, the Smart Museum, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago, all for co-sponsoring the Relational Futures Symposium. The symposium is going to continue tomorrow with a slate of really excellent panels about environmental justice in the Midwest, extraction in the Southwest, and water security and relationality. You can join us for those panels in person at the Logan Center at the University of Chicago or virtually, and you can view the full schedule of events through a link that I believe is going to be shared in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us for this opening event, and we look forward to continuing these conversations tomorrow. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in a few days. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. So we ask that you please support the Newberry by making a gift today. You can do so online at newberry.org/give. And finally, after checking out the Relational Futures panels tomorrow, we also encourage you to join the Newberry for its next program tomorrow night, Through the Flames and Beyond, commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire, which will be at 6:30 p.m. on the front steps of the Newberry Library. You can register for this and other future programs on our website, newberry.org. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your evening.